I will now provide a very brief commentary on the two segments that were read today. It's worth noting that already one of the segments had been divided in half. I only read one half on one day and then I finished it the next day. So we could say that now I would have caught up, so to speak, if I'd had to have it one day and then double up today in order to make sure that what would have been the second aspect regarding St. Paul specifically would have been the one due today. At some point in 2016, I came into information that the Minneapolis Federal Reserve had posted a extended public comment period concerning the capacity or the potential for a public bank and the concepts of a public banking system. Now, I had composed pieces outlining a potential proposal, actually more than one, early in 2016 that I put on a blog, which I no longer have access to. Included in there was a reference to an article that had been published in a publication based out of Chicago, Illinois, that was discussing a possibility of public banking models based upon, among other things, models that were existing at that point in Japan, as well as other countries. I personally had become interested in the considerations of a public banking model, specifically and technically specifically the year before, when I had encountered information that Ireland was in the process of attempting to establish 16 public banks throughout the country. I was curious to know what would be their conception of a public bank and how would it be able to function effectively. One of the things that I had recommended early in 2016, by at least the end of February, was a consideration of using something akin to the Postal Service. And by this time, there had been recommendations about the postal services and the postal service system as a sort of template that had been identified by other countries. But my understanding was specifically that the Postal Service was a government corporation and had a very specific relationship when it came to organizing, both on behalf of the workers, but also in terms of the assets or the specific and unique function it played within a society or a neighborhood. Much business is already accomplished at the local post office, including international business, including state business. And so the understanding of using an actual post office facility and then allowing for the individuals who worked in the post office to be initial investors by virtue of their actual work as an actual person that had access to some of the most fundamental practical material resources associated with the production of the entirety of the offerings available at the post office could provide a good foundation for allowing for the postal system, as well as people that work professionally with the postal system but also engage with the postal system as part of their daily activities, to begin a process of democratization around access to and distribution and circulation of economic information. Sometime later, I was at the public library in Chicago, and on, I believe, the fourth or fifth floor, they have a repository of government documents, including all of the treaties from the United States. There's more than one index for the official treaties of the United States, and they had two different indexes at the Chicago Public Library, downtown Chicago. And one of them correlated with their microfiche library, where they had a very extensive library of microfiche that were the original treaty documents. Among the treaty documents that I ended up in reading through and taking notes on at the time, 2016, was the Treaty for the the Universal Postal Union. The Treaty on the Universal Postal Union is one of the most unique things I've ever read. It was very encouraging, to be honest with you. There was a very specific manner in which the Universal Postal Union Treaty allowed for each country to specifically establish its own terms regarding activities, matters, and things specific to rates concerning internal operations of the postal service system for that country. It seemed to me to be very unique in that there were no preconditions for around particular matters. There were certain standards that need to be met, but then once those standards were met, in terms of being able to participate in a universal system, there was nothing to say that a country was too small or that it was too big or that it was too bound to other kinds of considerations of how it internally were to determine what would be the operationalization of the system within which it participated as part of this universal postal union. I was specifically interested in particular countries that were at that time, around 2016 and a few years before, very publicly engaged in efforts to have a formal reconsideration of what was alleged to be their national debt and the relationship of their national debt service. And by reviewing the Universal Postal Treaty, one of the things I saw was that were something like a public banking system akin to what was already being discussed even prior to me finding this announcement regarding the public comment period with the Minneapolis Federal Reserve. But it had already been a part of what I understood to be global conversations regarding public banks. Had there been more attention and been more support and less obstruction, then the elements of the Universal Postal Treaty, the Universal Postal Union Treaty that I was reading, seemed to be able to portend a lot of support for countries that were in a consideration of attempting to have a recharacterization or renegotiation of what were considered to be their obligations or their debt burden based upon standards that were ascribed or were determined by various kinds of financing or banking entities, including the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. So, unfortunately, I have not been able to find another version of this treaty. And once I came to Texas, I have not been able to find any microfiche that has that specific treaty. But I read the entire treaty and all of the annexes, in addition to other treaties, and I took extensive written notes on them. Those written notes and I were separated from each other by March of 2017. But I had them when I came to Texas and had the intention of trying to move forward on them and to try to see if there might be some support in Texas for something comparable. I've since learned that Texas has a very specific and significant relationship, not only with banking and a specific relationship with banking, but also with the history of bonds and specific processes connected to the issuances of bonds that I believe is unique in many ways to the Texas experience. But I bring this up today because there is a considerable intersection of factors that are converging at this time frame. As I said, this book was written more than 100 years ago. And with that understanding, it's important to identify it was also written by somebody that was not yet at the time appointed to the bench of the Supreme Court of the United States. This was before he became a justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. And the considerations of what his perspective on things as important as banking, and especially something identifying it in a manner as provocative as other people's money. What this portends, what this could potentially portend for us in this country as time goes on. And his early work becomes a part of what ends up becoming the wealth of the nation. The opinions and the work that he did as a member of the third branch of government, what that said about his commitments based upon things that he had started and embarked upon earlier, and what this literally, practically means in terms of our value. This book is from a public library. It is from a public library that is financed with municipal bonds that have been issued, in addition to whatever outstanding obligations that were already incurred since 2015. So, the understanding, I understand, is that this book is a part of the people's wealth. They had to have collateral, and they had to have an assessment of what the assets were that they had to work with to justify the terms of the financing in order to create the bonds that could then be put up for sale. Well, how do you pay on those bonds? Who pays on those bonds? More than just the specific tax or interest or commission to the individual broker or the investment banker, or even to those that are in charge of creating a specific portfolio evaluation that gives them whatever it is that allows them to be circulated. How do you meet your obligations in consideration? And who is required to meet those obligations? As he says, it's other people's money. It's ours. It belongs to us already. So how do we want our value characterized? One of the things that is said in here is very specific and very particular. This concept of accept upon a basis of par bids. Par. What do you want to redeem? What do you want redeemed? This is a very important question. It's a very crucial question for today and for these matters ongoing.